She stood in line like everyone else, calm, quiet, professional. 10 minutes later, she was in handcuffs. Not because she broke the law, but because someone decided she didn't belong. What happened next? You won't believe how fast the system turned on itself, and who she really was. This isn't just a story, it's a wake-up call. Stay with us until the end, because this could happen to anyone. If you believe in justice, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Let's talk about the moment silence met accountability, and lost. It started out like any other peaceful morning at the airport, the kind where everything feels routine and the day hasn't picked up speed yet. The sun was just beginning to warm the glass panels lining the terminal, casting a soft glow on the travelers slowly filling up the boarding area. People were sipping coffee, scrolling through their phones, checking emails or catching up on the news. It was quiet, familiar, predictable. That's exactly what Justice Maya Ellison expected when she arrived that morning. At 62, Maya had traveled more times than she could count. She was used to the rhythm of airports, the announcements, the quiet shuffle of carry-ons, the brief nods between people who just want to get where they're going without too much fuss. Dressed in a simple gray blazer, a pair of flats, and her hair neatly pulled back, she moved through the terminal with quiet confidence. She wasn't flashy. She didn't try to stand out. She never had to. There was a calmness to her, a kind of grace that came not from trying to be noticed, but from a lifetime of purpose and presence. In her hands, she held a slim black tablet filled with notes for an upcoming summit in Washington, D.C. She was scheduled to deliver the keynote speech at a legal reform event, something she had been preparing for over the past few weeks. It was a big moment, but she approached it the same way she approached everything else, with focus, clarity, and the kind of quiet discipline that didn't need to announce itself. Just a few feet away, seated in the first-class lounge area, Vivian Caldwell sat in a plush leather chair, sipping mineral water and adjusting her pearl necklace. Vivian was in her late 50s, well-dressed, well-connected, and very used to getting her way. She scanned the boarding area behind large designer sunglasses that stayed perched on her face, even indoors. She noticed Maya almost immediately. Something about the way Maya stood, calm, collected, alone, seemed to stir something in Vivian. She didn't recognize her. She didn't know her. But in Vivian's mind, Maya didn't belong. She couldn't quite put a finger on it, but she felt it. It wasn't about behavior, because Maya wasn't doing anything. It wasn't about noise or disruption, because Maya hadn't said a word. No, it was simply about presence. Maya's quiet strength unsettled her. Vivian leaned forward and whispered to the gate agent, spinning a casual concern into something more serious. A few careful words, just enough to raise suspicion, just enough to activate that unspoken bias that still lingers in too many places. The kind that doesn't need proof, just discomfort. The gate agent looked hesitant, unsure, but Vivian was persistent. She used the kind of phrases that make people nervous, that push buttons. And that's all it took. Behind the scenes, a call went out over the airport radio, and suddenly Maya, who had been calmly waiting for her flight like everyone else, became a name on a report. A target. The irony was that Maya didn't notice any of it. She was too focused on the text in front of her, reading through case law and refining her notes for the summit. She wasn't watching the room. She wasn't looking for trouble. She was preparing for a speech about improving justice. She had no idea that at that very moment, the system she had worked her entire life to improve was already moving against her. Not because she had done anything wrong, but because someone else decided she didn't belong. All it took was a glance, a whisper, and a lie. And the ordinary morning that began with quiet confidence was about to turn into something far more painful, far more public, and far more powerful than anyone expected. The call came through like any other, routine, vague, and barely detailed. 2 officers stationed near the main security office stood up, radio chatter buzzing low as they were dispatched to investigate a supposed suspicious individual at the gate. The description was thin, an older black woman, standing in the priority boarding line, possibly watching other passengers' bags. No one mentioned that she had already gone through security or that she was holding a tablet and a boarding pass just like everyone else. But that didn't matter. The moment the word suspicious was uttered, it triggered a response that skipped right over caution and straight into assumption. Officer Caleb Strickland, broad-shouldered and self-assured in that way that sometimes comes from wearing a badge too long without enough accountability, led the way. His partner, Officer Derek Miles, followed close behind. Derek was quieter, more reserved, but he rarely questioned authority or second-guessed orders, especially not when it came from someone like Caleb, who always seemed so sure of himself. Neither of them asked for further details. Neither stopped to question what suspicious really meant in this case. They didn't pause to check surveillance footage or ask the gate agent for a full explanation. They simply moved with certainty toward the gate, toward a woman they hadn't yet seen, but had already mentally categorized. Meanwhile, Justice Maya Ellison was still exactly where she had been for the past 20 minutes, focused, composed, completely unaware of what was headed her way. She wasn't bothering anyone. She hadn't spoken to anyone. She wasn't even looking around. Her eyes were on her tablet, scrolling through the final edits of her speech. Her boarding pass was tucked neatly into the side of her bag, her ID beside it. Everything about her was quiet, lawful, and completely unremarkable, unless someone had already decided she didn't fit. The officers entered the gate area with a kind of rehearsed authority that made people step aside without being asked. Caleb scanned the crowd with narrowed eyes, searching for someone who looked out of place, not based on behavior, but on a vague idea of what threat should look like. And in that moment, Maya, a dignified black woman in a gray blazer standing calmly in line, became that threat. Not because of anything she did, but simply because she was there and someone had decided she didn't belong. The gate agent, still a little unsure about how things had escalated so quickly, glanced between Maya and the officers as they approached. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. Caleb's attention had locked onto Maya like a spotlight. He didn't ask for her name. He didn't verify her seat. He walked straight toward her, ready to take charge of a situation that didn't exist. Maya turned slowly as she sensed them behind her. There was no panic in her expression, just a quiet recognition that something had shifted. She looked at the two men now facing her, both in uniform, both watching her like she'd done something wrong. And all she had done was wait for her flight. What followed was a series of questions that came too fast and with too little care. The tone wasn't curious, it was confrontational. They didn't ask if she needed help or if there had been a misunderstanding. They asked why she was there, what she was doing, what her job was, and why she was acting in a way that made others uncomfortable. The thing was, she hadn't done anything except exist. She'd stood quietly. She'd kept to herself. But their voices suggested otherwise, full of judgment and suspicion. When she answered calmly and requested their badge numbers, the temperature changed. It wasn't loud, but it was noticeable. Something about the way she spoke, the confidence, the clarity, challenged their assumptions. It didn't match the story they had already started telling themselves about her. Instead of listening, they grew defensive. Instead of reconsidering, they dug in. Caleb's posture stiffened, and Derek's jaw tightened. Around them, the crowd grew quieter. A few people started filming. This wasn't the kind of moment you could easily ignore anymore. Maya remained composed, not because she wasn't affected, but because she knew from experience that staying calm in the face of disrespect wasn't just about dignity, it was about survival. They never stopped to think they might be wrong. They never paused to consider that they were being fed a lie by someone who just didn't like the look of Maya. Instead, they acted. And with every word, every question, every step they took toward confrontation, they moved further away from reason and deeper into prejudice. It wasn't law enforcement. It was profiling. It was power being used not to protect, but to control. And Maya, who had spent her life upholding justice, was now being treated like a suspect simply for standing still in the wrong person's line of sight. Maya could feel the air change before she even turned around. There was a certain heaviness that came with being singled out, a pressure you recognize not because it's loud, but because it's familiar. She had felt it before, too many times to count, but not like this. Not here. Not now. When she finally faced them, Officers Strickland and Miles were already standing close, too close, with a seriousness in their eyes that didn't match the setting. They didn't look curious or cautious. They looked ready to act. Maya remained calm. She asked why she was being questioned, what the issue was. They told her it was due to a complaint, vague, unverified, and anonymous. No names. No proof. Just discomfort reported by another passenger who didn't like what they saw. And what they saw was a black woman in a business suit standing in a space they didn't think she belonged. Maya listened, not because she expected reason, but because she knew how important it was to show grace, even when it wasn't offered in return. She asked for their badge numbers, made it clear that she had complied with all procedures, and gently reminded them of her rights. But the more calmly she spoke, the more irritated Officer Strickland became. He didn't like being questioned. He didn't like her confidence. He didn't like how certain she was of her place, of her rights, of the law itself. For him, this wasn't about a safety concern anymore. It was about control. He pressed harder, raising his voice just slightly, stepping into her space to assert authority. Maya didn't move. She didn't back down. But she also didn't provoke. She simply stood still, composed and firm, holding on to her dignity like a shield. Then came the breaking point. In a voice strained by ego and frustration, Strickland warned her. He said if she didn't comply the way he wanted, he'd be forced to detain her. Maya, having already complied, stood silently. And that silence, dignified, unshaken, was the last straw for him. Without hesitation, he reached for her wrist. The grip was tight, unnecessarily forceful. There was no struggle, no resistance, but he treated her like there was. He twisted her arms behind her back and pulled out the handcuffs with a kind of decisiveness that made it clear he wasn't interested in de-escalation. He wanted submission. Gasps rippled through the boarding area. A few voices rose in protest. Some people began filming. But the officers didn't stop. They locked the cuffs on her wrists and began marching her through the terminal as if she were a threat, as if she'd done something wrong. Maya didn't fight them. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She walked, shoulders square, head high, even as her wrists throbbed under the cold steel. Every step she took felt heavier, not just because of the cuffs, but because of what they represented. Not just to her, but to everyone watching. She was a judge, the highest-ranking one in her state. She had spent decades interpreting, defending, and upholding the law. And now she was being walked through an airport like a criminal for doing nothing more than standing in line. The irony wasn't lost on her. It wasn't lost on the people recording, either. They didn't know who she was, not yet, but they knew what they were seeing wasn't right. In the small holding room just past security, they sat her down without explanation. Officer Miles stayed quiet, clearly unsettled, while Strickland continued to treat her like she was a threat. Maya sat calmly. Her hands still cuffed, her face unreadable. She didn't argue. She didn't need to. She simply asked again, this time more firmly, on what grounds she was being held. The answers were vague, inconsistent, and legally hollow. Then came the moment that changed everything. The moment when, calmly and clearly, Maya stated her full name and her title. The moment the officers, particularly Strickland, realized who they had just put in handcuffs without a second thought. There was a pause. A shift. A flicker of something between disbelief and fear in their eyes. And that flicker grew stronger when the staff on the other side of the desk confirmed it. She wasn't lying. She wasn't bluffing. They had just cuffed the Chief Justice of the South Carolina Supreme Court. The silence in the room after that was deafening. But Maya didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice or lash out. She just sat there, steady as ever, because the truth didn't need to shout. It just needed to be seen. And now, it was. At first, no one moved. The air inside the holding room felt heavy, like it was trying to catch up with what had just been said. Justice Maya Ellison. Those 3 words shifted everything. It was one of those moments that seemed to pause time, not with drama or noise, but with weight. The officers who had cuffed her only minutes ago now stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. It was like their entire sense of authority had been cracked in half, and through that crack, the truth was finally shining through. Officer Miles took a step back, his expression unreadable but clearly shaken. Officer Strickland, however, stayed rigid. His face turned red, not from embarrassment, but from the slow realization that this wasn't going away quietly. Maya didn't move, didn't say more than she had to. She simply sat, calm, collected, and dignified. She'd told them who she was. They hadn't asked. And that, more than anything, was the point. They didn't ask because they didn't think they needed to. They assumed. They acted. And now they were standing face to face with the consequences of that choice. The desk officer, who until now had been quietly typing behind the counter, glanced up at his screen. A few rapid keystrokes later, he turned the monitor slightly, and there it was, Maya's official profile, Chief Justice, South Carolina Supreme Court. Headshot, seal, term dates, full verification. No doubt, no mistake. The badge, the robe, the authority, everything they had ignored was now staring them in the face in black and white. Strickland leaned in for a closer look, as if somehow the screen might change if he just stared hard enough. But it didn't. Nothing was changing, except for the control he thought he had over the situation. Within minutes, a call had gone out to the U.S. Marshals. Maya had requested them herself, using the calm voice of someone who had memorized every inch of the legal process. She knew who to contact. She knew which protocol to trigger. And when the marshals arrived, 4 of them, dressed in suits, carrying quiet authority, they didn't need to be briefed. They already knew. A high-ranking judge had been detained without cause, and it was now their jurisdiction. The marshals didn't yell, didn't make a scene. They simply moved with purpose. The lead agent nodded respectfully to Maya and began instructing the officers to preserve every piece of evidence. Body camera footage, surveillance tapes, radio logs, and even the handcuffs used during the arrest. They weren't just taking over the case, they were turning the entire room into a scene for federal investigation. As more airport officials began trickling into the room, it became clear that this wasn't going to be contained. The airport police chief showed up, flanked by internal affairs and legal counsel. No one said much at first. They didn't need to. The silence spoke volumes. No one had verified her identity. No one had double-checked the report. A black woman standing calmly at a gate had been handcuffed and walked through a terminal in front of dozens of passengers, all because someone said they felt uncomfortable. Maya watched it all unfold, not with smugness or satisfaction, but with a measured focus of someone who had spent her life preparing for moments where the law was on trial. This time, the courtroom wasn't a building. It was this small, tense room at the back of an airport, where justice was now forcing itself into the light. Outside the precinct door, the world was catching up. Videos of her arrest were already making their way across the internet. Passengers who had seen it unfold were uploading clips, tagging news outlets, sharing hashtags. People were asking who she was. Then they found out. And when they did, the story exploded. Inside, the marshals began securing evidence and directing the officers to step away from Maya unless supervised. She requested photos of the marks on her wrists, the preservation of the cuffs as evidence, and documentation of every interaction that followed. The marshals complied without hesitation. The airport legal team watched silently, knowing this wasn't just a personnel issue, it was a federal incident. Maya stood, slowly and steadily. She didn't rush, didn't look around for approval. She didn't have to. The room already knew. She wasn't just a woman who had been wronged. She was the embodiment of what happens when you underestimate someone with power. Not loud, not flashy, but real, grounded power that comes from truth. And now that truth was writing its own record, one that would stretch far beyond the walls of that airport. By the time Maya stepped out of the airport holding room, the world outside was no longer the same. In the space of just an hour, a story that started quietly at Gate 4B had turned into a national headline. The footage taken by passengers, short, shaky clips of a calm black woman in a gray blazer being handcuffed without explanation, had started spreading like wildfire. The videos showed everything: her steady voice, her lack of resistance, the way the officers never asked who she was, and the crowd's disbelief as it all unfolded. Social media didn't need a press release to understand the heart of what had happened. It was clear. The hashtags came fast. Hashtag justice for Maya, hashtag she stood still, hashtag cuff the judge. Each one carrying its own wave of outrage, reflection, and calls for accountability. People across the country saw the same thing. Someone who looked like them, who had done nothing wrong, being treated like a threat simply for existing in a space someone else thought she didn't belong. But what made it even more powerful was the reveal that followed. She wasn't just anyone. She was the Chief Justice of the South Carolina Supreme Court. A woman who had spent her life protecting the law, only to have it turned against her in a moment of bias and carelessness. News outlets picked it up within the hour. Local stations ran segments as passengers who had witnessed the arrest started giving interviews. National networks interrupted regular programming with breaking headlines. Legal analysts weighed in on what the arrest meant, what laws had been violated, and what it said about the state of racial profiling in public spaces. Civil rights advocates, community leaders, and public defenders joined the conversation online, amplifying the story not just as a personal injustice, but as a symbol of a much deeper issue. This wasn't just about Maya anymore. It was about every person who had been judged, questioned, or detained without cause. People who didn't have a title to protect them or a camera to record what happened. For Maya, the noise of it all was just beginning to reach her. Inside the airport, she could hear the murmurs beyond the glass, reporters assembling, passengers whispering, people pointing at their phones. Her name, once something she had always carried with quiet pride, was now echoing through terminals and television screens. It wasn't fame she ever sought, and it wasn't a moment she would have chosen. But now that it was here, she understood its weight. Airport staff scrambled to manage the fallout. The gate agent who had watched the arrest unfold was pulled into a private office for questioning. Internal memos were sent out urging employees to preserve every piece of communication. Security teams started reviewing footage from every available angle, knowing that whatever was missing from the public videos would soon be requested by lawyers, federal agencies, and reporters. Back online, people were furious, not just because of the injustice, but because of how familiar it all felt. For many, Maya's experience wasn't shocking. It was a painful confirmation of stories they'd heard or lived themselves. The only difference was, this time, the person in handcuffs had the legal power and public voice to demand a response. And that changed everything. It didn't take long for public figures to start speaking out. Senators, activists, and celebrities began sharing the video, calling for reform and accountability. Some wrote threads about racial profiling. Others shared stories of times they had been followed in stores, stopped in airports, or questioned without reason. Maya's calm resistance had struck a nerve. It wasn't loud, but it was powerful. It reminded people that the most dangerous part of injustice isn't always violence. It's the quiet, routine nature of assumptions left unchecked. In the hours that followed, the airport issued a carefully worded statement about ongoing investigations. The officers involved were placed on leave pending review. But for the public, that wasn't enough. People wanted transparency. They wanted change. And most of all, they wanted to know what would be done to make sure something like this didn't happen again. For Maya, the whirlwind continued. She was escorted out of the terminal under federal protection, away from the flashing cameras and the growing crowd. But even as she left that space, the story didn't fade. It was gaining speed. Her name, her voice, and her quiet refusal to shrink had sparked something much bigger than any one incident. This wasn't just a moment. It was a movement. The courtroom was full before the hearing even began. Word had spread quickly, and people showed up not just to watch a trial, but to witness what justice could look like when it was finally given a chance to speak back. Reporters filled every seat in the press section. Law students scribbled notes from the back row. Families who'd followed the story online now sat side by side with attorneys and civil rights advocates. There was a quiet buzz in the air, part tension, part hope, all eyes locked on the two men sitting at the defense table, Caleb Strickland and Derek Miles. They weren't in uniform anymore. Gone were the badges, the bulletproof vests, the holsters. In their place were matching suits and stiff expressions. Strickland sat like he was made of stone, jaw clenched, shoulders squared. Miles looked smaller, quieter, maybe even regretful. The contrast was striking. Just weeks ago, these two had walked through an airport believing they held all the power. Now they sat in federal court, facing charges of unlawful detention and violating the civil rights of someone they never took the time to understand. When Maya entered the room, everything paused. She didn't enter with a crowd. There were no flashing lights or courtroom theatrics. Just the steady presence of someone who had carried herself through chaos without ever letting it define her. Dressed professionally, composed as always, She took the witness stand with a calm that was both grounding and undeniable. The room stood as she passed, not because they had to, but because something about her presence made people feel like they should. She didn't speak with anger. She didn't need to. Her words were measured, clear, and full of the kind of quiet authority that only comes from a life lived in pursuit of justice. She walked them through every detail, the boarding line, the questions, the cuffs. She spoke about the assumptions made, the refusal to listen, the failure to ask even the simplest question. Who are you? Then came the video evidence. The lights dimmed and the screen flickered to life. There she was, standing still, tablet in hand. The officers approached, their tone already set. No hesitation, no questions. Just action. The crowd in the courtroom watched in silence as the footage played. Then came the body camera videos. Audio of the officers' voices filled the room. No de-escalation. No verification. Just command, control, and an arrest that had never needed to happen. When the lights came back on, the energy in the room had changed. This wasn't a debate anymore. It was undeniable. The evidence had said everything that needed to be said. The prosecution reminded the jury that this wasn't about a misunderstanding. It was about decisions, conscious choices made in moments where better judgment could have changed everything. And now, those choices had consequences. The defense tried to argue stress, pressure, confusion in a high-security environment. But it didn't land. The jury didn't buy it, and they didn't need long to come to a conclusion. Just 2 hours later, they returned. Guilty. On all counts. Strickland didn't move. Miles stared down at the floor. The courtroom remained still, not from shock, but from resolution. Justice had spoken. Both officers were remanded into federal custody without bail. The judge's gavel came down like a punctuation mark on a story too long ignored. But Maya didn't celebrate. She didn't cheer or break down. She simply sat with her hands folded, her expression calm. For her, this wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. It was about what happens when people in power are finally held to the standards they enforce on others. Outside, the media broke the verdict in real time. Legal experts praised the clarity of the case. Community leaders called it a step forward. But inside, Maya remained steady. Because she knew the work wasn't finished. The criminal case was done. The truth had been heard. But the system that allowed it all to happen still needed changing. And she was already thinking about what came next. The courtroom filled even faster the day of sentencing. At this point, the story had become bigger than any single moment, bigger even than Maya or the 2 officers who had wrongfully arrested her. People weren't just showing up to witness justice. They were showing up to feel it, to be in the same space where consequences would finally meet accountability. The lines outside the courthouse started early, with everyday citizens standing alongside law students, civil rights activists, and reporters who had followed the story from the beginning. They came because they wanted to see what happens when a system that usually protects its own is forced to face someone who knew the rules better than anyone. Inside, officers Caleb Strickland and Derek Miles sat in silence. Their postures were tight, but the energy they once carried, the confidence, the authority, had drained away. They looked like men who finally realized they weren't going to walk away untouched. Their attorneys sat beside them, papers stacked neatly, expressions resigned. It had taken weeks to get to this point. The trial had laid everything bare. And now, the only thing left was the judge's final word. Judge Roth, a veteran on the bench known for her no-nonsense presence, opened the session with calm authority. There was no grandstanding. No drawn-out speeches. She addressed both men directly, acknowledging that they had no prior criminal records, but making it clear that their choices had consequences. They didn't just make a mistake. They acted on assumption. They escalated instead of de-escalating. They used their positions of power not to protect, but to punish. And the impact of those actions rippled far beyond a single day at an airport. The room was quiet when she handed down the sentence. 4 years in federal prison. No parole. No shortcuts. Just time to sit with the weight of their decisions, time to understand what it means to be stripped of the very authority they had once abused. The courtroom didn't erupt in applause. That wasn't the mood. It was quieter than that, more meaningful. The silence that followed felt like exhaling after holding your breath for too long. The officers were handcuffed at the defense table, the irony of it heavy in the room. The same cold steel they had placed around Maya's wrists was now locked around their own. No resistance. No words. Just the sound of metal clicking into place. This time, they were the ones being led away. And the image of that moment, of power finally being reversed, was something everyone in the courtroom would carry with them. But Maya wasn't there for that alone. Her focus had already begun to shift. Even as the verdicts were announced and sentencing handed down, another legal thread was unraveling. The civil case. Vivian Caldwell, the passenger whose false report started the entire chain of events, had been identified weeks earlier. She'd tried to stay quiet, to disappear behind silence and wealth. But it didn't work. Footage and passenger records exposed her. Her actions weren't vague discomfort. They were deliberate. She made a false claim that led to the unlawful detainment of a federal official. And now she was being sued. The evidence was overwhelming. The video, the gate agent statement, the audio recordings, they all painted the same picture. This wasn't fear. This was prejudice, weaponized in a setting where she thought no one would question her. Going to trial would have meant putting her behavior under a microscope, and it became clear she wouldn't survive that kind of scrutiny. So she settled. Quietly, quickly, but not without consequence. Vivian agreed to pay $450,000 in damages. She issued a written acknowledgement of her actions, entered into public court records, and faced a slow collapse of her public image. She was removed from boards. Her donations were rejected. Her social presence disappeared. The people who had once praised her now distanced themselves with silence. It wasn't public shame that broke her. It was accountability, and it arrived the way it always should, with facts, with law, and without noise. Maya accepted the settlement, but didn't linger on it. She didn't drag Vivian's name through the press. She didn't need to. What mattered now was the bigger picture, the work ahead. The case had shown the cracks. Now it was time to start sealing them. And Maya, as always, was ready to do that with the same quiet strength that had carried her from the gate at the airport all the way to this moment in court. After the cameras turned off and the verdicts were written into the record, most stories like Maya's would quietly fade away. But this one didn't. It grew. It shifted. It became something more than a courtroom victory or a viral moment. For Maya, it became a turning point, a line drawn in the sand, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been targeted, dismissed, or silenced simply for existing in a space where others didn't think they belonged. She had always known the law was a tool, but this time, she used it like a torch, lighting a path forward for others to follow. The civil case with Vivian Caldwell was officially settled, but the impact lingered. Vivian, once confident in her ability to whisper her discomfort into someone else's consequences, now lived in the aftermath of that choice. The internet had done what it often does, found her, traced her name through flight records and social profiles, and exposed the role she played in what had happened. And even though Maya never spoke her name publicly, she didn't have to. The truth found its own way to the surface. Vivian's world slowly unraveled. Her name was quietly removed from the boards she sat on. Charitable organizations began distancing themselves. Even the gala committee she had once chaired sent out a revised program with her name scrubbed from every mention. The apology she was required to submit wasn't heartfelt or public. It was court-ordered, factual, and written into the legal record. No one rallied behind her. There were no letters of support. She had used her privilege to weaponize a lie, and now, for the first time, she had to live with the cost. Maya didn't dwell on the fallout. She wasn't interested in revenge or gloating. She had something else in mind, something bigger. Instead of interviews or media tours, she turned her energy toward building. What came next was born from everything she had seen, heard, and felt, not just in the airport, but in every courtroom where voices had gone unheard, in every story that didn't make headlines, in every person who never got the chance to speak back. She launched a national initiative called Justice Forward, a legal aid network focused on supporting individuals who'd been wrongfully detained, profiled, or silenced. She didn't do it for fame. In fact, she turned down every book deal, TV pitch, and political endorsement that came her way. She wasn't looking to become a household name. What mattered more to her was the structure, the system, and the opportunity to give others what she had fought so hard to claim for herself: dignity, protection, and truth. Within 3 months, Justice Forward was operating in 5 major cities. It had taken on over 130 active cases and trained more than 50 volunteer attorneys. Maya visited community centers, spoke at law schools, met with public defenders, and worked with legal reform groups to draft stronger guidelines for accountability in transportation enforcement. At one point, a senator reached out about a potential run for office. She didn't even return the call. Because for Maya, the courtroom was already her platform. The law was already her language. She didn't need a new title. She needed a better path forward for those who'd never been given one. She kept a low profile, but her impact grew. The quote from her Chicago summit speech made its way across the internet. "They didn't cuff me because I was a judge. They cuffed me because they didn't care to find out who I was." It was powerful, honest, and unforgettable. But she never repeated it. She didn't need to. Her work spoke louder than anything she could say. In the end, the story wasn't just about an arrest. It was about what followed: the rebuilding, the refusal to let silence win, the calm resistance that sparked real, lasting change. Maya showed the world that power doesn't have to shout, that justice doesn't always need a gavel, and that sometimes the strongest voice in the room is the one that stays steady when everything else tries to shake it. And because of her, countless others now have a better chance to be heard, to be seen, and to be protected. Not because they're famous, but because someone finally stood up and made the law mean something again. This story isn't just about a judge or an airport, it's about all of us. It's a powerful reminder that dignity isn't something you earn by title, but something you carry through how you move, how you speak, and how you stand your ground. One of the biggest life lessons here is that calm doesn't mean weak. In a world that often rewards loudness, there's incredible strength in knowing when to speak with clarity and when to let truth speak for itself. It also shows us the importance of knowing our rights and having the courage to use them, not just for ourselves, but for those who may never get the same chance. For older audiences, especially, this story reinforces that it's never too late to stand for something, to lead by example, and to be the calm, steady presence in a world that often moves too fast and judges too quickly. Justice isn't just something that happens in courtrooms. It starts with the everyday choices we make to treat people fairly, to pause before judging, and to speak up when something's wrong. If this message moved you, let us know in the comments what types of stories or topics you'd like us to cover next. We're here to share powerful, real-life stories that inspire reflection and change. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story that reminds us what truly matters. Your voice matters, and we'd love to hear from you.